Birmingham was never kind. It was a city that built empires, but broke the people who made them. In its shadowed streets, young men learned early that law and justice belonged to the rich, and survival belonged to the fearless. The Peaky Blinders weren't born criminals. They were shaped by the world around them. Poverty pushed them. Society ignored them. Violence became their voice. They didn't chase power for greed. They chased it because it was the only way to be free. Every suit they wore, every fight they started, was a message to a world that looked down on them. We won't stay at the bottom forever. Before fame, before myth, there was pain, pride, and the will to rise. That's why the real Peaky Blinders existed. Birmingham, 1890. The air was thick enough to choke on. Smoke poured from the factory chimneys, rolling like black clouds over the rooftops of Small Heath. The streets were slick with rain and soot, and the smell of iron never truly left the city. It clung to the skin, to the breath, to the very bones of the people who lived there. In the heart of that city, life was cheap. Children worked from the age of 10. Their hands black with coal dust, their lungs already weak. The clang of machinery was constant, a rhythm of survival. Men walked to work with empty stomachs and heavy boots, and women waited in narrow houses that leaned on each other like drunks. Poverty wasn't a phase, it was the foundation of everything. From this world of noise and neglect, something began to form. It didn't start as an organized force or a criminal empire. It began as a whisper, a few boys banding together to protect what little they had, to survive. And soon, that whisper would become a name that frightened the whole of Birmingham, the Peaky Blinders. They weren't yet legends. They were just boys who refused to bow. The first of them came from the back streets, sons of factory workers, unemployed men, and women who scrubbed floors till their hands bled. Their clothes were worn, but they wore them with pride. A cap tilted low, a jacket too fine for their class. They called it style. Others called it arrogance. At night, the streets turned into battlegrounds. Drunken men argued over wages. Gamblers fought over lost coins, and police patrolled in pairs, never alone. In the gaslight haze, fights broke out over anything. A spilled pint, a glance, a word spoken too loud. The young men of Small Heath learned fast to survive. You had to be harder than the next man. One of those boys was Thomas Gilbert, though that wasn't always his name. He changed it often, sometimes calling himself Kevin Mooney. He was quick with his hands, quicker with his mouth, and always seemed to walk with purpose, even when he had none. He didn't lead a gang, then he simply refused to take orders. People followed that kind of defiance. Gilbert wasn't a visionary. He was a survivor, clever enough to see that loyalty could be bought with fear. He gathered boys who could fight Harry Fowler, Ernest Bales, and Stephen McHickey. They were young, reckless, and ready to carve their names into the walls of Birmingham's slums. Together, they began what others would later call the Peaky Blinders. At first, their crimes were small. A stolen watch, a bookmaker beaten for holding back winnings, a copper's helmet knocked off in the dark. But their reputation grew quickly. The streets carried stories faster than newspapers, and soon everyone had heard of the lads in the fine coats who fought like wolves. People said they stitched razor blades into their caps, a myth, most likely. The truth was simpler. They used their caps as weapons, swinging them with the weight of iron clasps. Still, the legend of the razors spread. In the pubs and factories, men whispered that the blinders could slice a man's eyes open with a flick of the head. That fear became power, and power was what they needed most. The gang was never about riches. There was no empire to build, no dream of running cities. It was about control of their streets, their pride and their survival. In a world that gave them nothing, fear became currency. The more people feared you, the more doors opened. Shopkeepers paid fees for protection. Bookies handed over shares of winnings to avoid trouble. And if anyone refused, the blinders made examples of them. The police tried to keep order, but they were outnumbered and underpaid. Many officers came from the same neighborhoods they patrolled. They understood the hunger that drove these men. Some looked the other way for a few coins. Others fought back. But every arrest only added to the blinders' reputation. One night, outside the Rainbow Pub, a constable tried to break up a brawl. A bottle flew from the crowd and shattered across his face. He staggered, blinded by blood, as the crowd laughed. Among them, a young man in a peaked cap smiled. From that night on, the word blinder carried weight. It meant someone sharp, stylish, and dangerous. In the day, the factories thundered. At night, the pubs overflowed. Men gambled what little they earned. Women sang to forget their hunger. And gangs roamed the streets like packs of dogs. The Peaky Blinders weren't the only ones. There were the Cheapside Sloggers, the Birmingham Boys, the Garibaldi Mob. But the Peaky Blinders were different. They had style. They walked in groups of 4 or 5, always clean, always proud. Their boots shone, their coats were pressed, and their eyes dared anyone to challenge them. They wanted to look like gentlemen, even if their pockets were empty. That image was power. A man in rags could be ignored. A man in a suit could not. Women noticed them too. Some were drawn to the danger, the defiance. Others feared them. But in Small Heath, power was attraction, and the Peaky Blinders had plenty of it. They danced in pubs, gambled, drank, and fought every night a performance, every fight a message. They weren't invisible anymore. By 1895, the name had spread beyond Birmingham. Newspapers began to mention them. Peaky Blinders attack police, one headline read. Their crimes were growing bolder. Assaults, robberies, even raids on businesses that refused to pay protection. They were no longer boys with nothing to lose. They were young men who'd found a way to take what they wanted. Yet beneath it all, they were still products of their world, a world that had abandoned them. The Industrial Revolution had made Birmingham rich, but only for those who owned the factories. For the rest, it had made life shorter, harder, and meaner. The Peaky Blinders weren't rebels against society. They were what society created when it stopped caring. There was one winter when everything froze: the pipes, the wages, the hope. Work stopped for weeks, and hunger turned to anger. Gangs grew larger as men looked for food or trouble, whichever came first. The Blinders began controlling entire streets, taking over betting operations and black market trades. Thomas Gilbert's group became known as the Blinder Lads, and other smaller gangs took the name as a badge of honor. Soon, there wasn't one Peaky Blinders gang. There were dozens, each ruling its own block, all sharing the same reputation for violence and pride. The newspapers painted them as monsters. Politicians called them a disease of the working class. But to some locals, They were heroes, boys who refused to bow to the rich or the police. In a city divided by class, the Blinders became symbols of defiance. They were proof that even the poorest could make the world listen, even if it was through fear. Still, time changes everything. The older members began to drift away, arrested or married, or simply too tired to keep fighting. The younger ones were wilder, less disciplined. Fights between rival Blinder groups broke out, and blood soaked the cobblestones of Small Heath more often than rain. Then came new names, Billy Kimber and the Birmingham Boys, men who thought bigger. Kimber wasn't content with street fights. He saw business in gambling, racecourses and protection rackets that stretched across cities. The old Peaky Blinders couldn't compete with that level of ambition. By the early 1900s, the legend was already fading. Some of the original members were in jail. Others had disappeared into the factories or the army. But the name lived on, whispered in pubs and shouted in police stations. The Peaky Blinders had become something more than a gang. They were a symbol, a myth forged from poverty and pride. Years later, when people looked back, they remembered the sharp suits and the violent swagger. They imagined kings of the streets, ruling Birmingham like an empire. But the truth was simpler and harsher. The real Peaky Blinders were not kings, they were survivors. They didn't rule the city. They endured it. What made them powerful wasn't money or weapons. It was the refusal to disappear. They took the worst life had to offer and wore it like armor. Their arrogance wasn't vanity, it was defense. In a world that treated them like dirt, they made themselves impossible to ignore. Even now, the old photographs tell their story better than any myth. Mugshots with cold eyes and slick hair. Young men who stared at the camera like they were staring down the world. No fear, no regret, only pride. Those faces are the truest history of the Peaky Blinders. Not the guns, not the glory, but the gaze of boys who wanted to be seen. When the First World War began, many of them were sent to fight. Some died in France, others came back changed. The war ended the old world of gangs and street wars for a time. Birmingham began to rebuild, cleaner, quieter, more controlled. But legends don't die so easily. The name Peaky Blinders stayed alive in the stories told in pubs, in the warnings passed from father to son. Don't cross a blinder, they said, even when no real blinders were left. The world would forget for decades. Then, over a century later, the legend would be reborn, stylized, dramatized, turned into a global phenomenon. But behind the television screens and tailored coats, the truth remains in the archives of the West Midlands Police, written in ink and blood. The truth of a city that built monsters out of misery, and men who turned poverty into power. The real Peaky Blinders didn't choose their path. The streets chose it for them. They were never meant to last. No empire built on fear ever does. But in their short, violent existence, they left behind something far stronger than control. They left behind a myth. A story of how pride can rise from dirt, how hunger can forge courage, and how even the forgotten can carve their names into history. And so, in the smoky heart of Birmingham, under the light of a dying street lamp, the legend began not with a plan, but with a punch, a scream, and a cap pulled low against the rain. The city never slept, not really. Even in the quiet hours before dawn, when the last pub door shut and the smoke hung heavy, Birmingham hummed a living, grinding machine. And in that machine, the Peaky Blinders began to find rhythm. The first few years of their reign were chaotic, scattered. Small Heath was divided into blocks, each claimed by gangs who fought not for money, but for identity. The Peaky Blinders weren't yet rulers. They were a name whispered with caution. But in the right hands, a whisper can become thunder. By 1895, Thomas Gilbert or Kevin Mooney, depending on the week, had turned his loose collection of street lads into a functioning force. They weren't an army, but they were disciplined by fear and loyalty. Every man had his role. Some handled gambling dens, others collected taxes from shopkeepers, and a few were kept for what Gilbert called dirty work, the kind that left blood in the gutters and silence in the witnesses. Gilbert's rule wasn't written down, but it was understood. Respect the name, protect your brothers, and never bow to a copper. It wasn't morality, it was order. And in a city that offered none, that was enough to make them kings. Small Heath became their stage. On a Saturday night, you could hear the noise from a mile away, music, laughter, and the dull thud of fists hitting flesh. Men in peaked caps filled the pubs, their coats lined with stolen silk, their pockets with someone else's money. They carried themselves like lords, but they never forgot the streets that made them. The Old Crown, the Rainbow, the Garrison Tavern, those were their haunts. Police knew better than to enter without backup. The locals learned to look down and step aside. When a blinder walked past, you didn't stare. You nodded once, respectfully, as if acknowledging a man who had earned his place by force. And in a way, they had. Every inch of Small Heath had been fought for. Rival gangs tried to take their ground. The Cheapside Sloggers, the Bordersley Boys, the Garibaldi mob, but the Blinders fought like cornered wolves. Knives, bricks, iron bars, anything that could break a skull was a weapon. The police called it an epidemic. The Blinders called it business. By the late 1890s, fear had become their greatest commodity. It was cleaner than theft, faster than gambling, and more reliable than luck. Every shopkeeper in their territory paid a weekly safety fee. It wasn't a request, it was insurance against windows being smashed, goods being stolen, or worse. At first, it was a few coins a week. Then, as their power grew, so did their prices. Men who refused were visited at night, quiet knocks, broken doors, broken bones. By morning, the message was clear. Most paid. Those who didn't stay long in Small Heath. Even the police, underpaid and overworked, learned to pick their battles. Some officers took bribes to look away. Others tried to stand firm and found their families threatened. A few were beaten so badly they left the force entirely. The city's order was shifting, and the Blinders were at its centre. But fear alone couldn't sustain them. Gilbert understood that real power came from control not just of streets, but of systems. He began sending his men to infiltrate betting circles, pub owners' meetings, and even factory unions. Wherever there was money or influence, a blinder was there, listening, waiting. They weren't thieves anymore. They were businessmen, brutal, cunning businessmen. If you had seen them, then the real Peaky Blinders, you would have understood why the city both feared and admired them. Their clothes were their armour. Tailored jackets, silk scarves, polished boots, pocket watches, things that no man of their class should have owned. But it wasn't vanity, it was rebellion. Every fine coat was a statement. We are not what you made us. They stole the image of the rich and wore it with defiance. A blinder didn't dress to blend in. He dressed to be noticed. The caps, the coats, the cigarettes, all of it became symbols of a new kind of working-class pride. Women were drawn to that image, two dangerous men in fine clothes, living fast, fearless, and untouchable. For many of them, being seen on a blinder's arm was a badge of status. For the blinders, it was armour of another kind respectability through glamour. Every night, their pubs became theatres. The air filled with smoke and laughter, the floorboards sticky with spilled ale. Deals were made over pints, grudges settled with fists, and through it all, the blinders smiled half menace, half charm. Power never comes without rivals. By 1898, the Peaky Blinders had drawn the attention of Birmingham's other underworld kings. Chief among them was Billy Kimber, leader of the Birmingham boys, older, richer, and far more ruthless. Kimber didn't like chaos. He ran the city's racecourse rackets, a business that made real money. Bookmaking, protection, transport, all of it flowed through him. The Peaky Blinders were a nuisance, unpredictable and loud. At first, Kimber tried diplomacy. He sent a messenger to Small Heath, offering Gilbert a share in the racecourse profits if they stayed off his turf. Gilbert laughed, then beat the messenger bloody, and sent him back with a note pinned to his jacket. "Tell your boss, the blinders bow to no man." That single act started a war. The first blood came outside a betting shop on Watery Lane. Two of Kimber's men tried to collect fees from a bookie under blinder protection. By sundown, both were in hospital, one missing teeth, the other missing an ear. Kimber retaliated hard. He sent a dozen men into Small Heath, armed with brass knuckles and iron rods. They smashed windows, burned a pub, and left one blinder half dead in the gutter. For days the city was chaos. Police wagons roamed the streets, sirens howling, but neither side backed down. Then Gilbert struck back with precision. Late one night, a fire broke out at Kimber's main storehouse near Digbeth. It burned for hours, lighting up the city sky. No one was killed, but the message was clear: the blinders could hit anywhere. Newspapers called it Birmingham's War of the Gangs. Politicians ranted in Parliament about lawless youth. But on the streets, people admired the defiance. The Peaky Blinders were becoming more than criminals. They were becoming legends. By 1900, the police had had enough. Chief Inspector Frederick Aberlin, the same man who once hunted Jack the Ripper, was brought in to restore order. His approach was simple: crush the gangs, starting with the Peaky Blinders. Raids began at dawn. Homes were searched, pubs shut down, men dragged from their beds. Dozens were arrested, including Gilbert himself. In court, he stood calm, hat in hand, as the judge listed his crimes: assault, robbery, intimidation. Gilbert smirked and said, "You can lock me up, sir, but you can't clean your streets." He was sentenced to 6 months in Winson Green Prison. But prison didn't break him, it made him famous. When he was released, crowds greeted him like a returning hero. The newspapers called him the gentleman gangster. The name stuck, and so did his legend. Still, the raids had weakened the blinders. Many members were jailed or fled the city. Kimber tightened his grip, expanding into London, while the Peaky Blinders fought to keep their shrinking territory. The golden age of Birmingham's gangs was ending, though no one realised it yet. Birmingham itself was changing. The city was growing cleaner, richer. Factories expanded. Trams rattled through new streets, and middle-class families moved in where slums once stood. The police were better funded, and the government introduced reforms to address poverty and unemployment. For the gangs, this was bad news. Poverty had been their ally. It kept men desperate, angry, and willing to fight. Now, there were jobs, unions, wages. The fire that had forged the Peaky Blinders was cooling. Some adapted. A few became businessmen, using their street smarts to run legal ventures. Others drifted into obscurity, swallowed by the very city they once ruled. But the legend never disappeared. Even as their power faded, the name carried weight. In the pubs of Digbeth and the alleys of Small Heath, old men still whispered, "That's where the Blinders drank," as if invoking ghosts. By 1905, the Peaky Blinders were fading into memory. The last of the original crew had scattered. Gilbert himself, older and quieter, had taken to living on the edge of the city. He'd seen too many friends buried or jailed to keep fighting. Still, on certain nights when the wind carried the sound of factory whistles and distant laughter, he'd put on his cap and walk the old streets just to remember. Birmingham had outgrown men like him. The gangs that followed Kimber's Birmingham boys, the Sabini mob in London, were businessmen first, criminals second. They wore suits, not caps. Their wars were fought in boardrooms and betting offices, not cobblestone alleys. Yet, every man who entered that world knew where it began, in the smoky pubs of Small Heath, in the hungry hearts of boys who refused to stay small. Years later, long after the last blinder was gone, their story remained, not in the records or the newspapers, but in memory. In Birmingham, myths live longer than men. Parents warned their sons not to fall in with the Blinders. Bartenders still told stories of the fights that shook the city. And when people spoke of them, it was never with disgust, it was with a strange pride. The Peaky Blinders were seen not just as criminals, but as symbols of rebellion. They were the voice of a forgotten class, rough, ruthless, but undeniably alive. That was their victory. They had no monuments, no graves marked in marble, but their legend endured, carried in whispers, in stories, in the swagger of every young man who refused to bow. In one of the final stories told about them, Thomas Gilbert was seen walking alone through Digbeth on a winter night. The snow was falling, soft and silent, coating the old streets like dust on memory. He stopped outside the Rainbow Pub, the place where it all began, and stood for a long while. Inside, the laughter was new, the faces unfamiliar. The city had moved on, but for a moment as the wind stirred the snow, it was as if he could hear the echo of his youth boots on cobblestone, the crack of a fight, the shout of victory. He smiled to himself, whispered, "We made them remember us," and walked away into the dark. No one saw him again. Some said he died penniless. Others claimed he fled to London and joined Kimber. But the truth doesn't matter anymore. What mattered was the myth, and that, like the smoke that once covered Birmingham, never truly disappeared. When the factories shut down at night, when the pubs emptied and silence settled over the city, the story of the Peaky Blinders lived on. A story born from hunger, pride and violence, the story of how the forgotten made themselves unforgettable. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were something in between, a reflection of a city that built itself on both beauty and brutality. And though the real Peaky Blinders are long gone, their spirit lingers in every man who dares to rise from the dirt and claim his place in the world. The winter fog rolled over Birmingham like a ghost that refused to leave. The streets were damp, the air bitter, and the city pulsed with a strange mix of fear and hunger. In the back alleys of Small Heath, where the Peaky Blinders had carved their name into every brick wall and every whispered conversation, a new kind of tension began to rise. They had won control of the betting dens and the pubs, and now they were looking beyond their own streets toward the beating heart of Birmingham itself. Arthur Shelby stood in the dim light of the Garrison pub, his fists resting on the table. Around him, a dozen men waited for his word. Their caps were tilted forward, razor-edged brims catching the glow of the gas lamps. The air reeked of tobacco and ambition. "We've got Small Heath," Arthur said, his voice rough as gravel. "Now we take Bawdsley." The men nodded, half in awe, half in fear. The Peaky Blinders weren't just a gang anymore. They were an empire in the making. Their suits grew sharper, their boots heavier, their knives faster. But for every inch they gained, the police, the rival gangs, and the city's elites took notice. Birmingham had always been a city of machines and money, but now it was also a city of gangsters. Behind the rise, though, lay something deeper, something that separated the Peaky Blinders from every other street mob. They weren't reckless boys chasing chaos. They were craftsmen of control. They built loyalty the same way factories build steel through repetition, pressure, and heat. A man in Small Heath didn't just fear the Blinders. He respected them. Their word became law. Their silence became power. But with power came something darker paranoia. Each corner held a spy, each pub a rumour. The Birmingham police, desperate to reclaim their authority, sent men undercover into the factories and bars. Some returned with stories of secret meetings, coded messages, and nighttime processions of men dressed like gentlemen, but armed like soldiers. Others didn't return at all. At the same time, rival gangs from Digbeth and Aston began to rise: the Brummagem Boys, the Sloggers, the Sabini allies from London. They came dressed to kill and eager to carve their own names into Birmingham's blood-soaked map. The Peaky Blinders could sense it. The storm was coming. One night, a runner burst into the Garrison, panting hard. "They hit our boy on High Street," he said, "took his money, left him bleeding." Arthur didn't blink. "Then we hit back twice as hard," he said. Within hours, a dozen Blinders moved through the fog like phantoms. The streets echoed with boots, curses, and the sound of shattered glass. A message was sent. No one touched a Peaky and lived without paying for it. But victory came at a cost. The police raided their gambling dens the next morning, dragging men out by their collars. For the first time, the Peaky Blinders realized they were being hunted not by street thugs, but by men with authority. Chief Inspector Melville, a name whispered with both respect and hatred, vowed to bring them down. He called them vermin in tailored suits, and swore to clean Birmingham's streets of their kind. Still, the Blinders were too deeply rooted. They had friends in factories, moles in the constabulary, and influence that stretched into City Hall. Every bribe bought silence. Every favour bought another week of freedom. The gang had become part of Birmingham's foundation, invisible but unshakable. And then came Tommy. Not the Tommy Shelby the world would later mythologize, but the real-life kind of leader, cold, calculating, born from hunger and forged in the back streets. He didn't shout to be heard. He whispered and people listened. Where Arthur brought fists, Tommy brought plans. He mapped the rival territories, studied the police patterns, and began to weave the gang's chaos into something that resembled order. He believed that violence was only useful if it built something. You can't scare men forever, he told his brothers one night. You have to make them want what you control. And that became the Peaky Blinder philosophy: control through desire, not just fear. They didn't just rule through blood, but through money, protection, and prestige. Tailors began making suits for them in exchange for safety. Bartenders poured their drinks before being asked. Even factory owners who once despised them began to rely on their protection to keep workers in line. The Blinders had turned crime into a business and Birmingham into a kingdom. But power is a hungry thing, and the city had many mouths. London's gangs wanted in. The Sabini Syndicate, led by Charles Sabini, had connections with racecourses, bookmakers, and corrupt politicians. They saw Birmingham as a territory ripe for taking. When Sabini's men began showing up in the north, buying off small-time bookmakers, Tommy knew it wasn't a coincidence. A quiet war began, one of money, influence, and fear. The Peaky Blinders sent messengers south with warnings. Some came back, others disappeared. Then one day, a fire broke out in a betting shop known to belong to the Sabinis. No one took credit, but everyone knew who did it. From that night, the Peaky Blinders were no longer just a local gang, they were a statement. Birmingham newspapers began to print stories about them. Gang of young men terrorizing city, one headline read. Another described them as fashionable criminals, with razors sewn into their caps. Some of it was true. Much of it was exaggerated, but the myth grew faster than the men themselves. The name Peaky Blinders became both a badge of fear and a symbol of rebellion. As their legend spread, younger boys began copying their style flat caps, three-piece suits, polished boots. They wanted to look like the men who ruled the streets, even if they didn't understand what it cost to hold that power. Tommy saw it happen and felt both pride and unease. Power was intoxicating, but imitation was dangerous. When too many pretend to be you, the real identity begins to blur. By 1903, the Peaky Blinders had reached their peak. They controlled the racetracks, the pubs, and the black market trades. The police struggled to touch them because every arrest led to a lawyer, and every witness mysteriously changed their story. They were untouchable, or so they believed. But the city was changing. Birmingham was becoming industrially modern, and with progress came new kinds of crime, new kinds of authority. The old ways, fists, razors, bribes, began to feel outdated. Younger, more ruthless gangs with guns and vehicles were emerging. The Peaky Blinders, once innovators of fear, were slowly turning into relics of a rougher age. Inside the garrison, Tommy sat alone, staring at a ledger. It wasn't the numbers that bothered him. It was the silence outside. The streets that once sang with chaos were now patrolled by constables who didn't take bribes. He could feel the shift. "We built this," he muttered, "and one day it'll bury us." Still, he refused to yield. He expanded into race-fixing and protection rackets outside Birmingham, even reaching as far as Nottingham and Coventry. But each expansion stretched them thinner. Every move forward meant more enemies, more betrayals, and more eyes watching from the shadows. One cold night, Arthur was ambushed leaving a pub. He survived barely, but the message was clear: their enemies were closing in. The Peaky Blinders had created a monster of influence, and now everyone wanted a piece of it. The gang began to splinter. Some members fled, others turned informants. The unity that once made them unstoppable started to crumble under the weight of greed and suspicion. Yet, in the hearts of the people, their image remained powerful. Children whispered their name. Men used it as a threat. Even as the real gang began to fade, the legend grew larger than life. The Peaky Blinders had become more than criminals. They were symbols of defiance in a world that crushed the poor. And that's what made them endure. They were born from injustice, fed by poverty, and killed by progress. But in their rise and fall lay the story of Birmingham itself, a city built by workers, ruled by the ruthless, and remembered by the brave. The fog returned that night, heavier than before. In it, shadows moved men in flat caps, walking toward a future they couldn't control but refused to fear. The streets swallowed their footsteps, but their name never vanished. It lingered in every alley, every pub, every whispered tale told decades later. The Peaky Blinders had come from nothing. They had ruled everything. And though history would try to bury them under myth and television fantasy, the truth remained in the cracks of those old cobblestones that for a brief, violent, unforgettable moment, they owned Birmingham. The city never forgot their footsteps. Long after the last razor dulled and the last alley fell silent, Birmingham still breathed their name in the smoke. It was in the hiss of the trains, in the rhythm of the factories, in the whispers that slipped through tavern doors at closing time. The Peaky Blinders were gone, but their echo clung to the walls like soot, and soot never washes off completely. When the new century rolled in, the streets looked different. Gaslight turned to electricity, and the old pubs that once trembled under their boots now hummed with gramophones. But even as time marched forward, the older men would glance over their shoulders when they heard laughter too loud, or the shuffle of polished boots on cobblestone. They remembered. They always remembered. Tommy walked those streets long after the gang had splintered. He carried himself like a man who knew the city was watching him. He had grown quieter, sharper, older, but his eyes still carried that same cold hunger. Some said he had made his money honest by then, horse racing, land deals, a whisper of politics. Others swore he still had men who did the dirty work out of sight, that his name still opened doors and closed mouths. Whatever the truth, Birmingham belonged to him in spirit, if not in law. Arthur had changed less. The fights had taken something from him, not his strength, but his peace. He still haunted the pubs of Small Heath, the king of ghosts in a city that had moved on. When he raised a glass, people looked away out of respect or fear. It was hard to tell which. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit alone outside the garrison, staring at the street as if waiting for someone who would never come. The younger ones, the boys who used to run errands and shout warnings when the coppers came, had grown into men with jobs, families, and memories that didn't sit well in daylight. They would tell their sons stories of the Blinders, but never quite the whole truth. They spoke of courage and pride, not of blood and broken bones. Over the years, the edges of the story smoothed out, like a coin rubbed clean by too many hands. And that's how the legend began. At first, it was just talk, a name dropped in a pub, a half-true tale told to impress a girl. But word spreads fast in a city that runs on rumour. Soon, the Peaky Blinders became something more than men. They were symbols of rebellion, of style, of working-class defiance. The poor saw them as heroes who stood tall in a world designed to keep them crawling. The rich saw them as warnings, the embodiment of what happens when society forgets its own children. Newspapers had once called them fashionable hooligans. Now, years later, writers and artists called them folk devils and urban knights. The same suits that once marked them as outlaws were now considered icons of British grit. History, as always, had rewritten itself, smoothing over the blood, polishing the razors, turning the rawness of their world into a story worth selling. Tommy, if he ever read those stories, would have smiled that half-smile of his part pride, part disbelief. He had always known that people preferred legends to truth. Truth was messy, complicated, and full of pain. Legends? Legends could be shaped. Legends could live forever. By the 1920s, Birmingham had changed beyond recognition. The factories boomed again after the war, but the neighbourhoods that birthed the Blinders were swallowed by expansion and order. The police had grown stronger, the gangs weaker. Yet, in every generation, someone tried to bring back the old ways to wear the cap, the suit, the swagger. None ever quite succeeded. They had the look, but not the cause. The Peaky Blinders had fought not just for money, but for dignity in a world that denied them even that. Without that hunger, the imitation was empty. Still, the myth refused to die. In the corners of boxing clubs and at the edges of racecourses, old-timers would lower their voices and say, "You should have seen them in their day." And the young men listening, eyes wide, would picture kings of the street in wool coats and steel eyes, their caps shining in the fog. Time, as it always does, took the bodies but left the story. Tommy's empire, whatever it had truly been, faded into quiet respectability. Some say he bought a house in the country. Others claim he vanished into London's underworld. Too clever to ever get caught. Too proud to ever retire. There are no records of his death. No grave that bears his name. Maybe that's how he wanted it. Maybe he understood that a man who becomes a legend shouldn't die in any ordinary way. Arthur's end was more ordinary, but no less haunting. One winter, he simply stopped showing up at the pub. They found him days later, still dressed sharp, sitting by the window as if he'd just drifted off. On the table beside him lay his flat cap, its lining torn where a razor once hid. The police report said natural causes. The city whispered otherwise. The world moved on, as it always does. Wars came and went, machines replaced hands, and Birmingham became a modern city of lights and glass. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, a mist still crept down the same old streets of Small Heath, and for a moment it felt like they were back, the echo of boots, the soft hum of danger, the glint of a blade that wasn't really there. People started telling new stories about them, books, plays, even songs. Each version made them bigger, sharper, cleaner. The grit was polished into glamour. The fear turned into fascination. They became cultural ghosts, drifting through time in suits that never wrinkled and hearts that never aged. The real blood that had stained those streets dried long ago, but the myth kept bleeding in the minds of those who needed it. Because the Peaky Blinders in the end weren't just men. They were an idea that no matter how cruel the world, someone could still rise from the gutter and walk like they owned the ground. That even in a city built on smoke and struggle, pride could shine brighter than gold. And that idea, once born, can never be buried. Years later, when television and film came calling, the legend was ready. Writers reached back into the fog of history, grabbed what they could, and filled in the rest with imagination. They gave the Blinders new faces, new fates, and new words. The world watched and believed, and suddenly the myth returned home only now. It was immortal. People who had never set foot in Birmingham spoke their name with awe. The razor caps, the tailored coats, the cold stares, all symbols now. In some quiet corner of the city, someone still walks the old streets. They pause by the remains of the Garrison Tavern, or what stands in its place. The walls are new, but the air feels the same. They swear they can hear the faint clink of glasses, the low rumble of men's voices, and for a second the line between past and present blurs. The legend still walks there, unseen but alive. Tommy once said, or maybe someone only imagined he did, that the world remembers stories better than names. If that's true, then the Peaky Blinders won the only war that ever mattered. They lost their city, their brothers, their lives, but they won eternity. And that is how Birmingham remembers them. Not as murderers or thieves, but as the sons of smoke and steel who dared to stand tall. Their story became the city's story, their pride its heartbeat. Every brick that rises where their boots once fell carries a trace of their defiance. As night settles over the canals and the street lamps flicker to life, you can almost feel them shadows in long coats, faces half hidden beneath caps. They are not gone. They are simply waiting, just beyond the edge of sight, where myths belong. The real Peaky Blinders were never meant to live forever, but they made sure they'd never be forgotten. They rose from the gutters and walked into legend, not with crowns, but with courage. And when the last storyteller stops speaking their name, the city itself will whisper it for them through the fog, through the factories, through the endless hum of history. Because somewhere, beneath the soot and the stone, they are still there, watching, waiting, smiling. And Birmingham still belongs to them. The story ends where it began in the smoke. Birmingham breathes it still, a living ghost that never learned how to fade. The streets are cleaner now, the factories quieter, but when the wind shifts just right, it carries the same metallic scent that once filled the lungs of men who built kingdoms from nothing. People walk the pavements without knowing the history beneath their feet. Beneath every brick, there's a whisper. Beneath every streetlight, a shadow that remembers. The Peaky Blinders are gone in flesh, but not in spirit. You can see them in the confidence of a man straightening his collar before a fight, in the sharp eyes of a worker who refuses to bow, in the rhythm of footsteps that never hurry, never fear. They've become part of something larger, not just Birmingham, not just Britain, but every soul that's ever stood up against the weight of the world. Their legend crossed oceans, screens, and generations because it spoke one simple truth. Power doesn't come from privilege, it comes from pride. The real Peaky Blinders didn't live long. They weren't gods or geniuses. They were products of their time, of poverty, of fire and fury. But in their defiance, they touched something immortal. They turned survival into art, struggle into style, and rebellion into memory. And memory once born never truly dies. If you stand alone on a Birmingham street at night and listen closely, you might hear them, the faint echo of boots, the low hum of laughter, the scrape of a match against brick. Not ghosts exactly, just reminders that legends don't rest easy. They came from nothing, ruled everything, and left behind something no empire ever could, a name that refuses to disappear. The fog rolls in again. The city exhales. Somewhere, a voice murmurs, soft and certain, by order of the Peaky Blinders.